So I just got out of seeing the new Lilo and Stitch movie, and I'm mad. I'm livid. And I think audiences in general are going to feel very angry and betrayed at the ways that this movie changed the narrative, the story, in ways that overtly undermine the message of the original film. I'm not going to get into spoilers until later in this video. I am going to talk about the changes that they made to this film later, but I will give you a clear spoiler warning before we do that. I at first want to talk about the other ways that this movie is very bad. Listen, I know that this isn't a surprising take coming from me. If you are at all familiar with my content, you have probably seen me bitching about how much I hate the very concept of live action remakes many times before. And that's true. I find them completely artless and cynical and pathetic, honestly, and I think they are overtly indicative of the fact that Disney is in a very dark period right now. And it's particularly upsetting because it is still an extremely lucrative period for them, unlike their other low points of creativity in their history, of which there are many, okay? But this film in particular, I think, is going to be extremely upsetting to audiences who are willing to go along for the ride for the first portion of this film before they're kind of blindsided by the changes made towards the end. So the other non-spoiler stuff, it has a lot of the same problems as all of the other live action remakes. The CGI frankly looks like shit, okay? It almost always does because these artists are never given enough time to do what they adequately need to do. But in this case, it's also particularly jarring for a couple of reasons. For one thing, the aliens are designed to look grotesque. In Chris Sanders' original art style, which, by the way, one of the reasons why the original film is so incredible to me is it's from this era of Disney when they actually were willing to take risks with their art style. They had carefully developed a house style, and after coming off of their most successful period ever, the Disney Renaissance, they took chances on films like Lilo and Stitch and The Emperor's New Groove and Atlantis and Treasure Planet and said, yeah, let's play around with the art style. And because of that, Lilo and Stitch is one of the most iconic films ever made because it was allowed to be in Chris Sanders' unique, beautiful art style that celebrated all of the beauty of Hawaii and the Hawaiian people in a way that the original Disney house style never would have. And so beloved characters that are cute in a kind of ugly way, like characters like Jamba and Pleakley, are just straight up grotesque and honestly kind of terrifying in this film. And I wouldn't be surprised if some kids find them extremely off-putting, which is probably why most of the runtime Jamba and Pleakley just look like humans, which also diminishes their dynamic in a lot of ways and also undercuts the believability of the story. I think that it becomes very obvious very early on in this film that some stories just work in animation only, and this is one of them, okay? Lilo and Stitch takes place in a world where aliens can walk around amongst humans even if they only have one giant eye or 6 eyes on their head if they remember to grab a Party City wig, fuck-ass Bob first. Like, that's the world that they live in. That's not the world that this movie is taking place in. And they interject such complex logistical nuance to like the dynamic that Lilo and Nani have in relation to the world around them that is just not going to be a clear message for kids. It muddles the message of the story, and it muddles the relationships of the story in ways that I feel like are very strange. It felt like they kind of took a bunch of scenes that they wanted to make sure that they included and just kind of were like, how can we string these together? We also need to make some changes because we can't make a shot-for-shot remake, which at this point, I just wish they would have just made a shot-for-shot remake. It would have been completely artless, but it would have been better than undermining the entire core message of the original film. The first 30 minutes are basically a shot-for-shot remake of the original film, and they include all of the jokes. And the jokes are good. They just look slightly worse because they're not animated in vibrant, beautiful 2D animation. They're shoehorned into this fucking, CGI monstrosity, okay? But yeah, there's a lot of similar problems that you see in a lot of these movies that are not unforgivable to the audience that eats this up every time, but not something that I enjoy or think is worthwhile at all. But let's get into the actual meat and potato spoilers of this, okay? So if you don't want to see, there's going to be spoilers. Just to rip the Band-Aid off, Nani gives up custody of Lilo at the end of this movie. Surprise! And if you're sitting there and you haven't seen the movie and you feel like you just got punched in the gut, that's how I felt this morning when I read a tweet that said that. And I thought, that can't possibly be true. That's when I booked the ticket to go see this movie myself. I wasn't even sure if I was going to talk about it. I think that it's incredibly irresponsible to take a movie that is about Native Hawaiian people, indigenous people, that are systemically disenfranchised by the state, by the U.S. American state, and say, you know what, actually, the state's the hero here. At the end of the day, the foster care system works, okay? Nani couldn't have taken care of Lilo. That was too much responsibility for her. I understand that Nani is a young woman and she didn't choose to be saddled with a child. She didn't have a kid. Their parents died. She got put in a shitty situation just like Lilo. But realistically, losing Nani, and by the way, Nani doesn't just give up custody of Lilo, she goes to college on the mainland, which I also think is a weird choice for a story that could have been, and in the original film seems to be, about celebrating their ancestral lands and rejecting colonialism, even in small ways. Strange choice. But it would be traumatizing for Lilo to lose her last remaining family member. They paint it in the film as this empowering thing that their parents would have wanted Nani to follow her dreams and be a marine biologist. I don't fucking get it. I don't think it makes sense. I think that children's media, and as much as people like to push back on this, Lilo and Stitch is a piece of media made for children. I still love it. And I think that media designed for children, like the Alice in Wonderland books and the Chronicles of Narnia books and A Wrinkle in Time, any number of films, they're still very much enjoyable for adults, but the messaging is very simplified because children don't have a logistical context for the way that the world works, okay? Putting scenes in this movie about Nani realizing that she has to make sure that they have insurance, okay? Having the social worker come to their house in the live action world feels far more jarring than it does in the animated world, because when they have to break into their own home and there's a pot boiling over on the stove, yeah, like in the real world, Lilo would be taken away from Nani that day. But this isn't a story that's trying to get into the logistical pros and cons of the foster care system. This is a story that's trying to teach children that sometimes life is horribly unfair and tragic, and sometimes things happen to kids that are unspeakably cruel, like they lose their fucking parents. And that is going to be a reality for some people in this world, for some kids. But movies like this are there to tell kids that even when life is horrible, you can be there for each other, and there will be people who will be there for you. And that's beautiful. Ohana means fucking family. I'm sorry, I'm literally getting worked up right now because I think it's ridiculous. And undercutting that message would be bad enough if it wasn't for the fact that Indigenous children are like disproportionately taken away from their families in the United States. Have been. There's a long historical precedent for it. And this movie seems to sugarcoat a lot of the commentary of the original film, pushing back on colonialism by having the vast majority of the characters be Hawaiian, or at least not white. Even like there's a couple getting married in the film at the beginning and they're like strategically not white looking. And I just feel like to suggest that this film that's about Native Hawaiian people ends with them choosing to, with the older one giving up custody of her sister to the state. Sure, they introduce a character, David's mother, who's like an elderly, like motherly figure that's lived next door to them their whole lives, and she's going to take custody of Lilo. I still think it's fucked up. I still think it's incredibly fucked up. I think it undermines the core central message of this film and what kids are supposed to take away from it, and also has a really poor real world parallel that does not seem well thought out at all. I really, really didn't like this movie. I think that it wasn't fun or funny up until the big change at the end, and then it was just outright uncomfortable for me. Ultimately, I really do think that Disney is in a very dark period in their history right now, and they've had ups and downs, and they've had, they've made mistakes, and they've had rebuilding periods. But for all of his faults, and he did have many faults, I think that Walt Disney cared about audiences, and I think he cared about legacy, and I think it's not isolated to Disney. I think a lot of studio executives in Hollywood right now don't give a shit about legacy. I think they care about money, and that's pretty much it. And I think that that's obvious with what Disney is doing right now. I think that I wish that their audience, their devoted consumer base, were able to divorce themselves from their blind loyalty for long enough to realize that they're being fucking played. But they are. And I think it's really sad for creativity and for the industry as a whole. And it also makes me sad as someone who like went and got a degree in animation and loves this medium and thinks that it's valuable and thinks that children's entertainment is incredibly important. I don't know how we crawl out of this, but I can't wait to do this all again next month for fucking How to Train Your Dragon.